On December the 15th, 1937, famous English paranormal investigator Harry Price was invited to a seance in London. In the seance, it was promised that a ghost child named Rosalie would materialise. Price accepted the invitation and put various controls in place that could detect any possible trickery. The two women who attended were Rosalie's mother, who they called Madame Z, and another woman who they called Mrs. X. Harry Price did not wish their real names to be revealed. Harry Price first heard about Rosalie on the 8th of December 1937 when Mrs. X invited him to her weekly Wednesday night seance held at her house in an upper-class London suburb. Mrs. X assured Price that if he attended her seance, he would not be disappointed, telling him that she would produce a genuine ghost. Before they began, Mrs. X requested that no scientific investigation was to take place, as Rosalie's mother feared it would frighten her daughter, and she would not appear. No lighting of any kind must be used, and Rosalie must not be touched or spoken to without permission. No experiments or anything else was to be carried out without consent, and if Price agreed to her terms, she would give him permission to carry out the following prior to the seance. He could search the entire house, which included the drawing room where the seance was to take place. He could seal all the windows and doors and remove any furniture or ornaments from the drawing room. He could sprinkle powder around doors and windows and place electrical contacts in these spots. All those that attended could be searched before and after the seance. However, once the seance began, he must sit quietly and ask permission before engaging with Rosalie or make any further adjustments in the room. Harry Price accepted the invitation on Monday the 13th of December and asked whether he was allowed to bring his own witness along, a man called Mr. Richard S. Lambert of the Listener magazine. Price received no reply to his request, so attended the seance alone on Wednesday the 15th of December. The house was a large detached mid-Victorian residence in a London suburb, and when he first arrived, he had dinner with Mrs. X, her husband, and their teenage daughter. It was during their meal that Mrs. X told him that Rosalie had been the daughter of her friend Madame Z, who was a former French nurse who had married an English army officer. Sadly, her husband was killed in the Great War in 1916, shortly after Rosalie was born. In 1921, when Rosalie was just 6 years of age, she contracted diphtheria and died a short time later. 4 years later, in 1925, Madame Z was suddenly awoken during the night to the sounds of her daughter crying for her mother, which then became a regular occurrence. Madame X described seeing an outline of Rosalie in the dark, followed by her footsteps on the bedroom floor, and on one occasion even felt her daughter's hand grasp hold of her hand. Mr. and Mrs. X were not mediums and claimed to have had limited knowledge of spiritualism, but nevertheless offered to host seances for a friend, Madame Z, in order to contact her deceased daughter. Their first seance was held at the end of 1928, and although she had materialised in her mother's bedroom, she failed to appear during the seance at Mrs. X's residence. However, in the spring of 1929, she made an appearance where she grabbed her mother's hand. The earlier seances were initially held in total darkness, where Rosalie continued to appear and would later answer questions from her mother, answering yes or no. Whether they had guests or not seemed to have no effect on whether Rosalie made an appearance, and after a while they slowly introduced light using hand mirrors covered with luminous paint. After dinner, Harry Price and other members of the family, along with Rosalie's mother, Madame Z, and a young 22-year-old bank clerk named Jim, prepared for the seance. The preparations included checking every room, including the attic, closing and locking windows, then placing strips of tape across the joints, which he initialed and sealed 3 external doors. Price then gave the drawing room a thorough inspection and made the following adjustments. Ornaments, photos and the clock were taken out of the room, and starch powder was sprinkled outside of the drawing room. Adhesive tape was placed across the door, lintel and windows, which he again initialed. Newspaper was placed under the chimney and also sprinkled with starch powder. and Price then drew his monogram in the starch, with the print from the newspaper showing through. All the furniture in the room was examined, moved, opened and emptied. The floorboard and rugs were examined and the wireless cabinet was inspected from the back. Everyone then entered the drawing room, whereupon Price locked the door and placed the keys in his pocket. Everyone in the house was now in the drawing room, except for the maid and cook. Finally, Price examined all family members, followed by Madame Z and Jim. The family's Airedale Terrier was also in the room during the seance. After everyone was seated, Price sprinkled more starch powder in front of the door and fireplace. Then 4 luminous plaques were placed face down in the middle of the circle of chairs by one of the hosts. Harry Price then took his seat between Mrs. X and Madame Z, and the seance commenced at 9:10 p.m. For about 20 minutes the guests quietly spoke, until Mrs. X asked for silence, and then turned on the radio to find suitable music. The radio was to the right of Price's seat, where the light from the radio illuminated the room, just enough for Price to make out faces. He could see that Rosalie's mother, Madame Z, was crying. After 5 minutes of listening to the music, Mrs. X turned the radio off, thus removing all forms of light. He then sat down in the circle, and for the next 20 minutes, Madame Z and Mrs. X cried whilst calling out for Rosalie. Then shortly after 10 p.m. and the room still in complete darkness, Rosalie entered the room, and Harry Price felt something close to him, but he neither saw or heard anything, and his sensation was an olfactory one. He seemed to smell something that was not there previously, that was strange but not unpleasant. Now that Rosalie was present, Price was asked not to speak, and the only sound in the silent room was Madame Z's cries and whispers to her daughter. Then Price experienced his first physical contact with Rosalie, where he heard a shuffling of feet on his left, while at the same time something touched the back of his left hand that had been resting on his knee. The hand felt soft and a little warm. Then a few minutes later, Mrs. X asked Madame Z whether Price could touch Rosalie, which she agreed to. After a physical examination, Price concluded that the figure standing between himself and Madame Z was a young girl. Price wrote that her skin felt warm, but not too warm, as one would expect to find when touching normal human flesh. Price also noted they could hear Rosalie breathing, and when he placed his hand on her chest, he could feel respiratory movements. Although it was totally dark, he concluded that the figure beside him was definitely a child. Harry Price said there are no words to express how he felt at the appearance of the form before him, or rather to the left of him. Her supreme scientific interest, with a feeling of absolute incredulity, would best describe his reactions. He had not bargained for anything so wonderful or so clever as this, but if he'd been tricked, so had the mother, and that was unthinkable. She at least was not acting a part. Price was then allowed to move his chair closer and examine Rosalie with both hands, where this time he lifted her arms and felt her pulse, which appeared to be too quick. He put his ear to her chest and could hear her heart beating. As the room was still dark, Price asked Mr. X, Miss X and Jim, who were sitting on the other side of the circle, to prove they were still in their original seats. Price was then granted permission to shine one of the luminous plaques on Rosalie, starting from her feet and gradually moving up the rest of her body, and concluded that she looked like a normal human child. He could see the soft texture of the flesh, which appeared to be without blemish. As the luminous plaques travelled upwards, the face of the form was revealed, and beheld a beautiful child whose features were classical, and she appeared to look older than 6 years of age. Price then asked to speak directly to Rosalie, and was granted 1 minute to ask the following questions. Where do you live, Rosalie? What do you do there? Do you play with other children? Have you any toys there, and are there any animal pets? However, each question went unanswered by Rosalie, who continued to stare forward as if she didn't understand what Price was saying. However, she did respond to Price's final question, asking Rosalie, do you love your mummy? Price saw the expression on her face change and her eyes lit up. Yes, she lisped. Rosalie had barely said a single word when the mother gave one cry and clasped her daughter to her breast. Mrs. X then placed the luminous plaques on the floor again and asked for complete silence, which was rather difficult as all the women in the circle were crying. Harry Price himself admitted that he was rather affected and was touched by the pathetic scene that had played out during the seance. Suddenly, the room was reduced to darkness one final time, and Rosalie departed as mysteriously as she had arrived. At 11 p.m, Mrs. X closed the seance. Strangely though, the Adele dog continued to sleep. Once the drawing room door was unlocked, Price checked the seals and powders he'd previously left around the house, followed by another thorough search. As far as he could tell, nothing was out of order. What Harry Price experienced that night greatly affected him.